I had been planning a solo adventure trip out into the sticks for a while. I don't know why, but being out alone in the middle of nowhere just sparked something in me that I can't find anywhere else. There was an old fire lookout perched in the woods that had been decommissioned in the late 90s, about 7 miles off the nearest access road. According to the hiking forums I frequented, it offered interesting views and was still in decent condition despite it no longer being maintained. Technically, entering these abandoned structures wasn't allowed, but numerous trip reports indicated people regularly used it as a backcountry shelter. I'd chosen a Thursday to make the trip, figuring I'd have the place to myself for sure if I avoided the weekend. The weather forecast showed clear skies, though temperatures would drop significantly at night at that elevation. I packed everything I needed: 3 days worth of food, water filter, sleeping bag, first aid kit, and my trusty Garmin GPS. The hike from where I would park my car would take most of the day, so I left early in the morning to be able to head off at sunrise. The first few miles followed an established trail, but eventually I had to branch off onto an unmaintained path that grew increasingly faint. I navigated primarily using GPS coordinates from previous hikers' reports. The forest grew denser as I climbed, mostly pine and spruce that blocked much of the sunlight. The quiet was profound. No cars, no planes overhead, just occasional bird calls and the sound of my boots on the fallen pine needles. By mid-afternoon, the trail steepened considerably. My legs burned with each step, but I knew I was getting close. After navigating a particularly steep section, I emerged into a small clearing and finally spotted the tower. It stood about 40 feet tall, a simple wooden structure with a cabin perched on top and a narrow staircase zigzagging up one side. It definitely looked weathered, the gray wood blending with the overcast sky. I approached cautiously, testing each step of the staircase before committing my weight. The wood creaked, but felt solid enough. At the top, a narrow walkway encircled the cabin. I paused to catch my breath and take in the view. Miles of unbroken forest stretched in every direction, the trees swaying gently in the wind. No roads, no buildings, just wilderness. The cabin itself was small, maybe 12 square feet. The windows wrapped around all 4 sides, offering a complete view of the surrounding forest. The inside was kept very simple. An old metal frame bed with a bare mattress that looked surprisingly intact, even though I wasn't going to risk sleeping in it. A small wooden desk, and what remained of a pot-bellied stove. Graffiti covered parts of the walls, including names and dates from previous explorers. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor and unpacked my food. There was still enough daylight to collect some wood for a small fire in the metal fire ring I'd spotted near the base of the tower. I wouldn't need it for cooking. I had my camp stove for that. But the thought of sitting by a fire appealed to me, as I'm sure the temperatures would drop as soon as it got dark. After getting everything set up, I heated some freeze-dried stew and ate while watching the sunset from the walkway. After an hour at most, the temperature dropped quickly. I packed up, climbed back up to the cabin, got into my sleeping bag and read for a while using the light of my headlamp. The silence was occasionally broken by the creaking of the tower as gusts of wind pushed against it. Eventually I switched off my light and tried to sleep. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when something woke me. The cabin was pitch black, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was. Then I noticed a faint glow through the windows. I sat up and peered out. In the distance, maybe a quarter mile away, a light moved among the trees. After watching it for a few seconds, I was sure that it had to be a flashlight. It moved slowly, weaving between trees, occasionally disappearing and then reappearing. My first thought was that another hiker had set up camp nearby, but that didn't make sense. There wasn't another established camping area in this vicinity, and hiking through these woods at night would be extremely dangerous without a trail. I watched as the light moved, trying to discern a pattern. It seemed to be circling, gradually getting closer to the tower. After about 20 minutes, the light vanished. I continued staring into the darkness, my eyes now adjusted enough to make out the silhouettes of the nearest trees in the faint starlight. That's when I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, perfectly still, facing the tower. My mouth went dry. I reached for my headlamp, debating whether to signal them or remain hidden. Before I could decide, the figure raised one arm slowly, briefly turned on their flashlight, before retreating back into the forest. I remained frozen, straining to see or hear anything else, but there was nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably just another hiker who had noticed the tower was occupied and decided to move on. Still, I double-checked that my knife was in my pocket before lying back down. Sleep didn't come easily. The sound that woke me the second time was unmistakable. Wood creaking under weight. Someone was climbing the stairs to the tower. I checked my watch. 3:17. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickly pulled on my boots and grabbed my Garmin, not bothering about my other backpack and my sleeping bag. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, each step bringing whoever it was closer to the cabin. I moved to the opposite side of the cabin from the stairs, considering my options. The only way down was the staircase, which the stranger was currently climbing. I could try to confront them, but if they had malicious intentions, I'd be trapped. The creaking stopped. I could only assume that they'd reached the walkway. I held my breath, listening for footsteps on the walkway, but heard nothing. After what felt like minutes, I slowly moved toward one of the windows. I peered out onto the walkway. Empty. Gradually, I checked each side of the cabin. There was no one on the walkway at all. Confused and terrified, I stood in the center of the cabin, trying to process what was happening. Had I just imagined it all? That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound coming from directly above me. On the roof. Without thinking twice, I bolted for the door. Just as I reached it, there was a heavy thud behind me. Something, or probably someone, had dropped down from the roof through the hatch in the ceiling. I didn't look back, just yanked the door open and sprinted onto the walkway. Heavy footsteps pounded after me as I raced toward the stairs. I took them two at a time, nearly falling several times, the wood groaning dangerously under my frantic descent. Above me, I could hear my pursuer on the walkway moving fast. I risked a glance up and saw a dark figure rounding the corner of the walkway toward the stairs. I reached the ground and sprinted for the trees. Once in the forest, I switched on my Garmin. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate it, but I managed to figure out which direction I had to take to get back to my car. All my equipment was still up in the cabin. I only had my Garmin, my car keys, and my phone with me. I was freezing cold out there, but I didn't dare go back towards the cabin. Navigating through dense forest at night without any light was probably one of the hardest things I had ever done. After what felt like hours, I finally found the main trail and maintained a fast walk, constantly looking over my shoulder. The sky began to lighten just as I reached my car. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. To this day, I don't know who was at the lookout tower or what their intentions were. Maybe it was just another hiker playing a cruel prank, someone planning to rob me, or something even worse. Whatever the explanation, I never went back to that tower even though my whole gear is still there. About a year ago, I decided to take a hiking trip on a long weekend. I work a lot of hours Monday to Friday, and getting out into nature allows me to clear my head, that other things, like alcohol, just can't. The trail I had marked out wasn't completely off the grid, but it was remote enough that I wouldn't have to deal with crowds of weekend warriors or family campers. On the first day, I hiked about 8 miles along the ridgeline, taking in the spectacular valley views, before finding a suitable area to set up camp. The weather was cold, but not too cold. I guess you could call it the perfect camping weather. Once it was dark, the sky was completely clear, and you could count every single star. I built a small fire, cooked a simple dinner, and fell asleep listening to the gentle sounds of the forest. I woke up early the next morning, since I didn't really come all the way out here to lie around in my tent. I packed up my stuff and continued along the trail. The section I was on wasn't difficult, but it was narrow in places with steep drops on one side and dense forest on the other. I hadn't seen another hiker since embarking on my journey, which was kind of what I expected and hoped for. But at the same time, it felt weird, having gone more than 24 hours without any human contact. Around noon, I reached a plateau and stopped to eat lunch and took in the view. That's when something far out in the distance caught my eye. It was smoke rising from among the trees about a mile or two from where I was. It definitely wasn't a bonfire by any means, just a thin wisp, like someone might have a small campfire going. It struck me as strange since there weren't any designated camping areas in that direction, and it was pretty far from any official trail. After finishing my lunch, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate, making sure to mark my path clearly so I could find my way back to the main trail. I checked the compass on my phone from where I could see the smoke and kept walking in that direction to make sure I wouldn't start walking in circles. The smoke had dissipated by the time I reached where I thought it should be, but I found the remains of a recent fire. There was nothing else there, and I also didn't see any remains of a potential campsite. I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't really describe what I had felt. Whoever made this fire definitely wasn't the ordinary camper, and if this person was still in the area, I didn't know if I'd want to encounter them. I suddenly regretted even walking towards the smoke and turned around and rushed back in the direction I'd come from. On my way back to the trail, a feeling suddenly came over me that I was being watched. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. Several times I stopped and turned around, convinced someone was following me, but I never saw anyone. I finally made it back to the main trail and breathed a sigh of relief. I decided to continue hiking for another couple of hours before setting up camp for the night, wanting to put some distance between myself and whatever strange sight I'd discovered earlier. By dusk, I found a good camping spot next to a small stream. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and tried to get rid of the uneasy feeling that had settled over me today. As darkness fell, I built a fire larger than I normally would have, finding comfort in its light and warmth. I was heating water for my freeze-dried dinner when I heard a faint whistle from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campfire. At first I thought it was a bird, but the closer I listened I was convinced that it was human-like. I froze, straining to hear more, but the forest had gone completely silent. I called out, asking if someone was there. My voice sounded thin and afraid even to my own ears. No response came, but a few minutes later I heard the whistle again, this time from a different direction. It was either a different person this time, or it was the same person, and they were circling my camp. My heart started hammering in my chest, and I fed more wood into the fire, trying to push back the darkness. Once the flames created more light, I saw two figures standing in between the trees, about 20 yards out. They were both wearing dark clothing that blended with the night, making it hard to discern any details. I could see that it was a man and woman. The man was tall and thin, the woman shorter and slightly hunched. If I had to guess, I'd say they were somewhere in their late 30s to early 40s, but I couldn't really tell. After a moment of just standing there in silence, I asked what they wanted, trying to keep my voice steady. Neither spoke, but the shorter figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me. They remained completely still otherwise, just watching. I asked again who they were, and why they were out here so far from the trail. After what felt like an eternity, the taller one finally spoke. In a voice that was barely above a whisper, and I couldn't even tell if he had spoken English. Before I could say anything, the woman took a step forward, and I noticed something gleaming in her hand. A knife or some other metal object catching the firelight. Without thinking, I grabbed my hiking poles, prepared for the worst and ready to defend myself if necessary. But then, first the man, and a second later, the woman, both turned around and ran back into the woods and the darkness. I just stood there for what must have been at least a minute, not knowing what had just happened. Had I somehow set them off? I had no idea. There was no way I was going to sleep now. I decided to break camp immediately, even though hiking at night wasn't really a smart thing to do. But I had no idea what these people wanted, and if they would return, so staying seemed far more dangerous. I packed my gear and left the fire burning. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie down my pack. With my headlamp on its brightest setting, I set off back toward the trailhead. It was about 15 miles, which normally would have been a full day's hike, but fear was a powerful motivator. The trail was treacherous in the dark, with roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. But I pushed on. About an hour into my desperate night hike, I heard someone running through the forest parallel to the trail. The footsteps were light and quick, but I couldn't see any flashlights. Then from the other side, more running footsteps. The footsteps would come closer, then retreat, only to approach again from a different angle. Sometimes they'd stop completely, and in those moments of silence, I wondered if somebody might jump me as I'd pass the next tree. Occasionally, I would also hear the whistling sound that I had heard earlier at the campsite, making it absolutely clear that these were the same two people harassing me. This went on for at least 2 or maybe 3 hours, but as dawn was about to break, it all stopped. I was absolutely exhausted at this point, having hiked through the night with barely any water, but I didn't want to stop. I just wanted to get out of there. By 10, I stumbled into the parking lot where my car was waiting. I threw my pack in the trunk, jumped behind the wheel, and drove away as fast as I safely could. It wasn't until I was back on the main highway that I finally began to breathe normally again. I never reported what happened because technically I wasn't harmed, and I doubt that anyone would believe me anyway. I had no idea what the intentions of that man and woman were that night. Maybe they were some hippie couple who had taken a couple pills more than they should have and randomly came across my camp. Or they were from the not-so-friendly side and wanted to hurt me, I don't know. And to be honest, I don't think I want to know either. I've never been back to that area ever since. I'm a 31-year-old female from coastal Oregon who decided to take a road trip through the mountain ranges of Northern California. For the past year, I had been living out of my converted SUV, not because I was poor and couldn't afford to pay rent, but because it allows me to live a lifestyle that lets me travel wherever and whenever I want to. I usually avoid designated campgrounds and well-known spots, because it makes me feel somewhat trapped. Instead, I prefer to go off-road, deep into the national forests, where you can go days without seeing another soul. I was exploring the Klamath National Forest, taking my time on the narrow winding roads that cut through the dense pine forests. The weather forecast had mentioned a cold front moving in, but that wasn't going to stop me. My SUV was stacked out with all the equipment needed to survive several days in the wild. After driving most of the day on an extremely remote forest dirt road, I turned onto what appeared to be an old logging trail. I checked my offline Google Maps that I had downloaded before taking this trip, but the route I was on didn't show up on the map. However, the trail was just wide enough for my vehicle, so I kept moving forward. After crunching over what must have been a couple billion pine needles, the trail eventually opened up into, I guess, an old logging area. The clearing was in a roughly circular shape, almost too perfect to be 100% nature's work. I decided that I was going to camp there for the night. A slight wind had picked up by now, so I parked next to a cluster of trees to get some wind protection, and aligned it so I could see the sunset through my windshield. I pulled out my portable stove and made myself one of the many canned meals I had brought along. As darkness fell, the sound of birds gave way to the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of nocturnal creatures. I sat in my camp chair outside the vehicle for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the clear sky above the clearing. The cold was becoming uncomfortable, though, so I eventually packed up and climbed into my SUV and let the day pass in my head before nodding off. I jolted awake sometime later, disoriented and feeling unease. Checking my watch, I saw it was just after midnight. I'm a deep sleeper, and I'm used to all kinds of nature sounds out there, so I was confused as to what had caused me to wake up. That's when I heard the distinct crunching sound of footsteps outside. I froze, listening carefully. It could easily be deer or some other animal foraging in the night. But after listening some more, and judging by the rhythm, it became very clear to me that this was no animal. What I was hearing out there were human footsteps, and there could not be more than a couple of feet away from my car. I slowly reached for my flashlight and double-checked that the doors were locked. I couldn't see out, and nobody could see into the vehicle either, as I had put all the window covers up. Still, I didn't want to cause any movement that might reveal that there was actually someone inside. I listened again, but the footsteps stopped. Seconds stretched into minutes of complete silence. Just as I was about to relax, there was a sound of branches breaking, probably less than 2 yards from me. My heart raced as I weighed my options. Who on earth is out there, and what is this person doing so close to my car? I could turn on the SUV's lights to see who was out there and what they wanted, but at the same time I didn't want to reveal myself. Being a woman alone in remote places comes with a lot of risks. Suddenly I heard whispered voices outside. I tried to understand what was being said, but it was too quiet. Nevertheless, this told me that there were at least 2 people out there. I tried to push my thoughts away from all the bad scenarios, but couldn't wrap my head around any reasoning that made sense. If there were legitimate hikers, they would have no reason to come up this close to my vehicle. After another few moments, I heard the sound of the door handle of one of my doors being pulled. The door was locked, of course, but it sent a slight shake through the vehicle and I had to cover my mouth to stop myself from screaming. The handle of the other door jiggled now, more forcefully than the first attempt. Then came a knock on the window. I remained absolutely still, my hand now gripping my flashlight as the only weapon I had on me. After another series of knocking, a voice called out, "Forest Service. This is private property, you can't park here. We know you're in there. Please open up." Their tone was friendly, reasonable even, but it made no sense. If they actually were legitimate forest rangers, first of all, why would they come here in the middle of the night? And second, why would they try to open my doors before announcing themselves? Every bone in my body was telling me that something was off, and I just stayed put. After realizing that I wasn't reacting, I heard more knocking, followed by the Forest Service announcement. This went on for at least another 5 minutes. At one stage, I decided to lift one of the window covers and peek outside. I only lifted a tiny part of the corner to be absolutely sure these people wouldn't notice me. In the darkness, I could just about make out 2 figures. They wore dark clothing, but I couldn't recognize any type of uniform or official identification. This confirmed what I had been suspecting from the beginning. These people were not who they say they are. I was aware that something bad was about to happen, unless I got the hell out of there. I carefully climbed into the driver's seat and pulled out my key. I knew that I had to start the car, remove the cover of the front windshield, and pull away before these people understood what was going on. While the knocking was still going on, I counted down from 10 in my head. At 0, I put the key into the ignition, started the motor, yanked away the cover, released the handbrake, and put my foot on the gas. It took me a few seconds to adjust to the brightness of my headlights, but I could see that I had a couple of spare yards in front of me. Just as I was pulling away, there was heavy knocking on the driver's side window. On the other side, one of the figures came into the light of my headlight, revealing that he was wearing a black ski mask. He tried to leap on top of the engine hood, but didn't quite manage to do so in time. I accelerated down the logging trail, branches scraping along the sides of my SUV as I struggled to stay on the narrow path in the darkness. My headlights bounced wildly as I hit ruts and rocks, but I didn't slow down. In one of the side mirrors, I could make out 2 flashlights, growing smaller and smaller in the distance, before completely vanishing round a corner. I kept on going at that pace for at least another 15 minutes before I finally reached the Forest Service road. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, but I didn't stop and instead kept moving, stopping only at a gas station about an hour later. When I finally had cell service again, I called the county sheriff's office to report what had happened. I never found out if they caught the men from that night, or if they ever did investigate for that matter. I still live out of my vehicle and continue to visit remote places, but this experience had left me deeply disturbed, knowing something bad could have happened had I opened the door to those men.